All right, so we are now approaching the very ends of the semester. This is our last week, and so this is one of our last two lectures. Today we're going to talk about the end of empires and the Cold War as we're coming out of World War II. And then next time we're going to talk about globalization and terrorism and technology. So when we're talking about the end of empires, what needs to be understood is that coming out of World War II, the many of these nations have become pretty weakened by the extension of and the expending of their resources for the war effort. And so likewise, not only has Great Britain and France and Russia been greatly affected by this global war, but all of these nations had imperial interests, and those imperial interests were also utilized. Uh, India as a nation of part of the British Empire was their military forces were used vastly in this global war. We have to remember that a lot of the war on the German effort did take place on continental Europe, but there was an entire aspect of the war that did take place in India, and it also took place in Africa as well. And so these nations are also greatly affected by the war as well. As a result of World War II, Great Britain and France in particular realized that they could not continue to maintain their vast global empires that they once had, and the nations that had served them very well during the war were also asking for some allowances, freedom, independence, uh, and they gained it during this time period. In 1947, India gained its independence from Great Britain, and likewise, the North African countries of Tunisia and Morocco also gained their independence from France. Now, another thing that happened coming out of the World War II effort is there became this great mobilization and a need to rebuild Europe. And with that need to rebuild Europe, a lot of these people from Africa and from Asia started immigrating to the continent of Europe and also to Great Britain. This is why to this day there is such a large population of people from India in Great Britain. Coming out of World War II, these people used their mobility and the opportunity that was taking place to rebuild London and the rest of England to relocate there and to serve in the crafts and to help rebuild the nation and to help get the nation going again. And so we also see this uh, relocation of many, many individuals or immigration taking place globally as well. And of course, having the plane and having the freighters and having passenger ships on the sea made this mobility a lot more easier coming out of World War II as well. So the other main aspect that we're going to talk about today is the Cold War. And so let me go ahead and cover some of the major components of the Cold War that need to be kept in mind. First of all is with the employment of weapons of mass destruction by the United States in August of 1945 to end the Pacific Theater by dropping the A-bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There ended up being a arms race that took place. Other nations wanted to make sure that they also had the same kind of weapon capability that the United States currently possessed. And so Russia also started to engage in a very rapid development of weapons of mass destruction. Along with the race for weapons of mass destruction, you also have the development of what is known as the space race. In October of 1957, the first unmanned satellite is launched into space by Russia, and the first man in space in 1961 also is successfully launched, and a Russian cosmonaut makes it into space, breaking through the atmospheric barrier, and before plummeting back to Earth. And so this is the weapons race, and the space race ends up being symbols of power and influence. Some of the characteristics that you want to keep in mind considering the Cold War is this is a battle between the socialistic, communistic countries and the free market democracy that is taking place. As I already mentioned, you have the space race and you have the nuclear arms race. The two communist nations to account for are USSR and China, and the free world of Britain and France, and particularly the United States of America. With that being said, there's always satellite countries that get involved in this Cold War interests, and there are other nations that are being lobbied by either the United States or by USSR or China during this period. And two of those nations that end up being caught up in all of this is Cuba and Vietnam. Cuba becomes one of the communistic nations, a fascist ruler who has control and makes alliances with the USSR, which we'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in a bit. And then also Vietnam, we'll talk about that in a bit as well. As a result of the development of the Cold War, Truman, president at the time, in March 12th of 1947, institutes what has been known as the Truman Doctrine. It's been said that the Truman Doctrine thus amounted to a declaration of ideological Cold War, along with a declaration of geopolitical Cold War. Now, what is this Truman Doctrine? Well, with all of the decolonization that is taking place throughout the world, these countries are forming their own constitutional identity and their own political ideologies, and they're having to make a choice. Whether they are in Asia or in Africa or in South America, these many new nations that are coming into existence, and by 1985 you have 100 new nations since World War II. All of these nations are making a decision about whether they're going to become communistic or they're going to take on a free market economy and become a democratic republic like the United States. And so Truman sees that there is a real ideological war that's taking place, and that the free world really depends on the United States being a global leader for free market, capitalistic economy, and democratic republicanism. And so he makes this doctrine, and he says, at the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. And so what Truman is saying is that the USSR and China is possibly using oppressive means to subjugate other peoples and other nations, forming puppet governments and puppet alliances in which they are having shadow empires that basically take place, where there are these economic and political alliances that are taking place, where trade, importing and exporting of goods will take place between like-minded ideological countries, and they are going to incentivize those people that fall underneath their authority. And Truman is saying that we're also going to incentivize. We are going to fund, we are going to trade with, we are going to do business with those countries that follow a capitalistic ideology, and we are going to enable them politically and support them and help them create their infrastructure and give their citizens the ability to vote and to have a democratic republic representation in government. And so Truman, over the course of the next many decades, followed by other presidents, are going to continue to reinforce this doctrine and support those nations that are going to take on a capitalistic and democratic republican identity. I do have to backtrack a little bit and do have to say that coming out of World War II in February of 1945, you have the all-important Yalta Conference. As a result of the Yalta Conference, you have ideas like the United Nations coming into existence, and the United Nations becomes a very important globalization force that helps create a global identity for geopolitical nations so that they can do trade with one another and they can enforce commercial laws, and they can, as technology develops, e-trade laws that become regulated, and also other sorts of ways in which people are protected, individual nations are protected from injustices through this united confederation of nations that are going to in some way police the world with mainly particular global leaders that are represented here: Britain, America, and the USSR, Joseph Stalin, Harry S. Truman, and Winston Churchill. One of the other events that is really important for this time period is also in May of 1948, Israel becomes an independent nation. With the independent nation of Israel, you have many of the injustices of the Holocaust in some ways getting the first steps of rectification. Giving nation and giving the Jews a national identity puts them at a table at the United Nations in which reparations can take place for the global effect that has taken place upon the Jewish people. Also, you can have a court of trials taking place in which uh, war criminals of the German military might be executed, and the actual existence of the nation of Israel becomes extremely important in order for some of that to take place. Likewise, Israel having their place in the Middle East and their position as a nation becomes extremely influential, especially with its long-term alliance with the United States. Coming out, coming out of World War II, you also have the shifts and changes that take place with Germany. Within Germany, Germany is actually sliced up between the Russians and the other allies, Britain, France, and America. Germany itself is an iron curtain is spread across it, and so East Germany falls underneath the USSR communistic, militarized, and politicized rule. And then West Germany is separated between Great Britain, France, and the United States. What is very interesting is that the western part of Germany, where it is a democratic republic and capitalistic in mindset, also is where a lot of the factories and a lot of the industry had already been in Germany. And so this ends up being extremely good for the capitalistic world. It ends up being really bad for the East Germans, who typically end up having a tough time getting supplied. In fact, throughout the occupation of East Germany by the Russians, there are drops that are taking place from America supplying the East German people with capitalistic propaganda and foods and supplies. Berlin is also divided, as you will see. And Berlin itself has its Western German and Eastern German, and even the Western German sectors, there is a Great Britain, France, and American sector between the two sides. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about communism in Asia.